Welcome to Public Comment. I'm John Dunbar, former mayor of Yountville.
And I'm Alfredo Pedroza, former Napa County supervisor.
Thanks for joining us while we talk about politics, people, and whatever else is on our mind.
Bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy got in the way.
And all that is making the cost of building housing more expensive.
That's an example of taking action that actually supports a population.
There's not one silver bullet to this.
Okay, Alfredo, what are we going to talk about today?
I think we should talk about housing, John. And I'm hesitant to say affordable housing because too much of the time when we say affordable, an image comes up. And I think to me, when we talk about housing, it's people that look like you and I, right? It's people that we know. And it's a huge issue in our community. And I think we have to find a different way to address it because what we've been doing doesn't work.
Well, it's about housing supply, but it's also about the kind of housing that's being built and is available. It's rental, it's to own, it's all those things. And it does really reach generations.
Yeah.
It reaches different socioeconomic levels. So it really does affect our whole community.
Well, look, in my frustration with it, John, is, affordable housing always shows up on a poll. When we're running for office, it's the number one bullet point or top three. So we're all talking about it. It's showing up in the polls. But yet when you look at the solutions, it just seems like it's the old solutions of yesterday. And we're expecting different outcomes. Well, we're trying to solve the problem the same way and we think it's going to be different now. It's not, and it's getting worse. And for me, when I look at the demographics of Napa's getting older, it's getting harder for young families to move into Napa. It's getting harder for employees to open up, buildings in Napa or locate their businesses here. And when you hear the common theme, it's access to housing. So it's impacting so much, yet the solutions aren't changing.
Well, we saw the very, very real consequences in Yountville when our elementary school was closed.
Yeah, that's real.
Because of low enrollment. That was fundamentally the issue.
But what prompted low enrollment?
We didn't have young families that could afford to live there for
Bingo.
the most part. Right. And it's not unique to Yountville, but it is one of those layers of the challenge. So it's not just about housing. It's about the impacts of not being able to attract different levels of either individuals or families. Young families can't afford $1 million home necessarily. Not all families want 2-story, large yard, big lawn to mow and the 30-year mortgage. So we need to acknowledge people are living differently today than they used to. Opportunities need to be built differently to address that.
Look, you said a lot there. And to me, just going back to your Yountville example, that is a consequence of not having housing that's affordable. Schools closing. That's real, right? So I just wanted to kind of double click on that. But when you talk about, housing type, when you mentioned mowing the lawn, I kind of laughed because I remember one of the first homes that Brent and I bought, it was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, corner lot, big backyard. I'm like, this is it. We've made it. And then it's like, holy hell, we don't have enough money to furnish those other 2 bedrooms that we're not using. Or I'm working and I have to go mow the lawn because we don't have enough money to pay our landscaper. That wasn't the right house for us. Now, it worked out because, we were able to, leverage it to buy another home, but it wasn't the right house. And I think you're underscoring on the housing that's being built. It's of yesterday. It's not of the future. Now, some people may want that single story or double story home, but not everyone does. And when you look at what's being built, it sure seems like it's the cookie cutter approach. And then you wonder why people aren't moving here. And now on the same side though, I take my mom living in a 3-bedroom house and she doesn't have a room, doesn't have a need for those 2 other bedrooms. Now she's not going to move, but how many people are stuck in that home when they shouldn't be because there's no other housing type that's available? We could call the Meadows out as an example of a different type of housing being built. But I think one of the things I want to hit on today is the type of housing that's being built. I don't think it's being built for the needs of tomorrow.
Well, dare I call out positively what the state of California did a few years ago. Miracle, right? Government actually took good action.
You must be drinking a lot of wine.
Not yet, but they acknowledge, to your point about senior living, there are a lot of folks that can't afford to move. they own a home that they don't need anymore. The family's grown up. They've gone on to have their own lives outside of that family home, for example. 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath,
Yeah.
very common. 2 stories, even common. But now that senior couple doesn't need the bedrooms. They don't want the stairs, whatever, but they weren't able to transition to something more appropriate for their lifestyle. The state of California at least allowed people over the age of 55. Yes, I'm one of those people.
I wasn't going to call it out.
That allows them to transfer their property taxes. So that if they are downsizing or changing the way they're living, they can change their financial commitment to that new home that makes it more affordable. That's an example of taking action that actually supports a population. There are some programs, and I know that the County of Napa has done some of this with proximity workforce housing and other types of housing. There are some solutions for very specific populations.
Yeah.
There needs to be a broader perspective change about what is it we're investing in terms of housing.
Look, I agree with you, right? And I think we've hit on the supply side, right? And reimagining how people live, I think is cool and exciting, and that's fun. But, taking a step back, some of the things that alarm me, right, is these trends of what we're seeing. Home ownership dropping among millennials and the younger folks to your point, they don't want a 30-year commitment to their home. Like, that's alarming. So why is that happening? I think we need to understand that a little bit more. Now, on the plus side, home ownership among our Latino community is increasing. We should know why. Why is that happening? So I think we can't just accept some of these data points for what they are. We have to kind of take a deeper dive and say, what is causing that? Like, that's what, to me, I'd be very curious by. But then also, like, the affordability, right? When my parents bought a home in 1992, right, it was $190,000. My dad and mom were making good money, right? My dad was a farm worker and my mom was, taking care of kids. They could afford to buy a home. When you look at the price of homes today compared to real wages, the prices of home have grown exponentially compared to real wages. I'm not arguing that we should go do something on wages, because that's about creating skills that allow you to earn more money. But it just illustrates what happens in a normal community when there's supply and demand. And I think for Napa, we have to focus on the supply side. And some of the things that I'm curious about, right? And you tried to do this in Yountville, so I'd love to learn more about what you were trying to do with the Vets Home. But what makes it hard to build housing is the cost of building housing and the process, the political nature of getting housing to be built. We all love it until it's in our backyard. And we talked about NIMBYism in a previous podcast, but that's real. So if I'm a developer, buying the property costs money. Hiring consultants costs money. Hiring attorneys costs money. Then I have to submit an application. That costs money. Then I have to go through the process. And I have to keep paying that consultant, that attorney, to keep interacting with the city and the county to respond to neighbors that have concerns. And then I go to a public hearing, and that costs money. And all that is making the cost of building housing more expensive. So then we wonder why it costs so much money to build housing. It's that process. And then when it goes to us as decision makers, we say, well, we want you to cut off X amount of units because you're creating too much density. What do you think is going to happen? So that, to me, is not a community that's prioritizing housing. It's just lip service around it.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the veterans home situation. That was an effort that I had for over 10 years, and it ended up not resulting in any housing being developed, which is really frustrating. It was a classic example of the bureaucracy in Sacramento just shutting down a great idea. And it wasn't just my idea, but I was basically championing it when I was mayor, and I had all the different agencies lined up, ready to go, from the Veterans Affairs to General Services, Housing and Community Development. Those are all the factors that get into these kind of significant development projects. It was going to eliminate a lot of the cost for a developer. Basically, the state was going to provide the land at no cost. That's a huge upfront cost to developers usually. And they were going to be allowed to have no impact fees that would normally take place in the cities or the town. It made total sense. They're providing 150 to 200 basically apartment units available to the caregivers for the veterans at the vet's home. Who could say no to that? Well, leadership in Sacramento, bureaucracy got in the way. They had another priority about what they needed funding for, and so it never happened. But you're right about sometimes the cost to developers is too significant for them to want to do a project. But there's also the term that I hate the most is that it doesn't pencil out. That's what I would hear from developers, from me being at the town perspective, about why does it have to cost so much? You identified a lot of the reasons for that, but the development community needs to buy into this need as well. And I think in the long run, they'll still make plenty of profit.
Look, I got to push back on though, John. The developer doesn't have to buy into the need. They're running a business. They're not there to make us feel good about housing. They have investor money or bank loans, and they got to go build something that makes money where they can pay the bank back and pay the investors back. They're not a philanthropy organization. They're a business organization. So that's different. Now, we got to hold them accountable, right, to making sure that they're developing, what they commit to. The issue that I have, and you kind of hit on it with what you were trying to do in Yountville, which is kind of the solution of predictability, giving developers predictability of what they can build. That's real, but it's an accountability tool of, we want this, you can build that, so let's make sure that we, isolate that from noise and politics so it gets built. That's predictability in the process. The way you do that is by having buy-right housing. And what that means for someone listening is you go to that pocket of property. For example, I'm going to date myself, but remember where Swinson's used to be, the grape yard? Imagine if that was housing. It's not today, but imagine if you went to that and said, you know what, in the future, we foresee this corridor being housing. So we're going to put an overlay to say, in the future, this will be housing. And then you have the Caltrans yard right across the street. And we say, well, that's going to be housing too. So what that means for a community is that in the future, that might be housing. What that means for a developer is that it's predictable and you don't have to get extracted or negotiate against someone that doesn't want that project. So it makes the possibility of housing more predictable, which is to me what you were trying to do in Yountville. That's real. But then when we talk about that to politicians, and we were one of them, well, we don't want that because it's local control. We want to make sure that it's unique, it's beautiful, it adds value. Well, you can do that too, but you want to control everything. You're creating more uncertainty in the process, which makes housing not be built or become more expensive.
So here's a problem with your thesis on predictability.
I want to hear this.
South Napa, there was a large property, family owned for generations, the Gazletta property, that was zoned for housing for decades, and it's never been developed. Then a project came forward to develop housing on a housing parcel, and the neighbors fought it, just like we've seen happen throughout the valley on a variety of development growth projects. And all of a sudden, that was pristine land that was the gateway to Napa, which has never been the gateway to Napa. However, people said no. They didn't care that it was zoned for housing.
Yeah.
So what good is predictability when you then can just have a group of neighbors that say, we don't want it here?
Well, they're both, I know the Gazlettas, they're
both
friends.
Things are true.
and I know Joe, rest in peace. Joe was a very good man and his family's good. I think that's unique because, it's in the county and the city and county can't get along and it complicates things. But you're right. I think predictability can come in different degrees, right? But predictability does help eliminate the politics. And that's what I'm saying, John, is the more that you can provide predictability, the more that you can negotiate with the developer to get what you want. And maybe you work with them to say, hey, I want a child care center in the housing complex. Maybe you want a gym. Like there's things you can get that are value add, but when they have to take these risks, it makes it less certain that that's going to happen, right? So like that's one. And I also think, employers have to help address it too, because it's a recruitment issue. It's a retention issue. So these big employers, what are they doing to be part of the solution? And I know that, and I don't want to use the term, glorified dorms for adults. That's not what I'm going for. But I do think there are part of our workforce that they don't need their own kitchen, their own living room, right? If it was more shared space, there might be something for that. And all I'm saying is we got to be creative. And I transitioned to like Picasso, right? That was innovating second home ownership through technology. Like that's cool. We need more of that. Instead of vilifying, new folks that want to do things differently, let's embrace it. And I think we have to use those different platforms to figure out a way to make housing more accessible and housing more affordable and housing more predictable.
Yeah, Picasso is an interesting business model that I didn't find fault with either.
But let's explain it, because I think we mentioned it, but I don't think people might know what it is, though.
Well, when basically they would buy a home and allow 8 different owners of that property. So you're just splitting it up. Some people argued that's a timeshare, and they would argue, no, it's not. It's shared ownership. What I think a lot of folks that were opposing Picasso didn't appreciate was that kind of relationship has existed for a long, long time. Families that have siblings that inherit a home, those are separate owners of a property, and they share the time there in some cases. You're also assuming that people that are 1/8 owners of a property are going to be bad people, bad behavior, bad actors.
Yeah.
When I was living in Yountville for almost 26 years, I had a bad neighbor that lived full time there. And I would have welcomed 8 different neighbors because you don't guarantee that just because somebody owns a property full time, they're going to be good people and good part of your neighborhood. Yeah. So be careful what you wish for.
Well, I think the magic around Picasso, and I don't want to digress, was instead of 8 people buying second homes, right? Each their own individual home, they were buying one. So it was aggregating. So it actually was helping second homeowners not buy more homes. It was consolidating them into one, which I think was the magic behind that. But I use that as an example of how it was a different way of addressing homeownership. Granted, in the second homeownership category, but I think that's what we have to do for housing in general, right? People want to live differently. For example, downtown Napa, building more housing, downtown Napa is cool. I tell Brenda, if we get to live to the age of retirement, I know you're closer to that, right? You're probably already retired, I think. But imagine living downtown where you can go and dine at your best restaurants and walk home and go up an elevator or climb the stairs and be home. Like, that's cool. So we should supply that type of housing. We don't want that now, but we might want that in the future, right? And if my kids, when they're at the age they go to college and they want to come back, maybe they don't want to live, in a regular home. Maybe they want to live in an ADU if I have an ADU, right? So ADUs are part of the solution. And I think that's what we have to accept is there's not one silver bullet to this. There's multiple solutions that need to be put on the table, but we have to invest in those differently.
Yeah, ADUs, accessory dwelling units. And we took that very seriously in Yountville also, where encouraging those to be developed. You get away with costs and fees are waived and things like that to provide the housing units. Yeah. What we also found, though, was most people that were doing it initially were doing it just to extend their house. Basically, it'd be where kids would come and stay during their summer break or where grandparents might live. It was not actually providing new housing units for people that couldn't afford their own home. We required, if you wanted all the benefits of it, you needed to make it available to the public. There are those creative solutions, but we need to first address who the people are that are looking for homes and what type of living they want. Like we said in the beginning, it's not all 2-story big family homes with large mortgages. It's more diversity. It's identifying that we have an economic development component to this, where we have, in some cases, a transient workforce. They're in hospitality, restaurants, retail. They might be here for a few years and they want to live in a smaller space that they don't have to maintain. So are we building condos? Are we building duplexes? Are we building multiple stories where somebody that doesn't want to have to go upstairs might be able to live on the first floor? I don't see enough of that. We're doing some affordable housing from a cost perspective, but are we providing different living situations? Are we providing different entry levels for renters or buyers?
We're not, right? And I think we're trying to apply the same model, right? You take money here, you combine it with this funding source, and then you go build housing, and then you get sued by the neighbor, and you wait it out, but we build it. And it takes time. It's a slugfest. That's the old model. And when you look at kind of our history, right, the workforce proximity program, giving a shout out to former supervisor Mark Lewis, that was a pilot program. And now it's become a permanent program because it helped people with down payment, right? It was recognizing that people were earning enough money, but they didn't have the down payment to go buy that home. So the government came in and provided the assistance to help them buy that home. Like, that's what I mean by innovation. But we keep talking about that program because we haven't done anything innovative since then. And I'll criticize myself because I was part of it too, right? But you got to keep trying. And I think that is what's different now is you have an ability to do things differently, but I don't think we're fully embracing that opportunity to your point of the type of living that people want. People don't want, in my opinion, they don't want to live the way they lived yesterday, right? It's different now.
Well, and I would try to make it clear to our residents when I was mayor that if we don't embrace more housing in our community, this is true about every community, it's going to happen to us, not with us, because there is a lot of pressure to add housing in California. It comes from the governor's office on down, and it is an economic driver to have workforce. You need somewhere for them to live, and people need to understand if you don't allow some of that development and that growth, it will be forced upon you. Because I remember people saying, "Oh, we don't want 2 stories, 3 stories in Yountville." I said, "Well, if we don't do something, the state's going to not care about your view shed, and they're not going to care about the density. They're going to care about building homes." That was their perspective.
And look, what the state does, it's hard to say, but I think for us is let's focus on what we can do. And I think there's enough here, John, where we can do things differently. And I think that's a call to action, right? Like pilot new programs, do things differently, invest in them, right? So that way we can create meaningful outcomes.
We acknowledge that there are good projects out there. There are dozens of smaller housing projects, but is it the right unit living that people want? And I don't know that that's really what's happening. I think it's being checked off of a form that we say we just added 25 housing units that are affordable. But is the population there wanting to rent and buy those?
Look, I think this is a big issue that we're going to have to spend more time on. And I think today we've laid the foundation in some of the areas that I think we have to focus on more. But time will tell whether we get this right? But the fact is we need a lot of partners to step into it. So
and I also think that it's possible that if we build smaller properties with less yard, there may not be the need for leaf blowers.
Which we're hearing right now. Cheers.
Alfredo, I think we did a nice job of scratching the surface on housing, but there's a lot more to talk about.
Well, look, no one expects 2 former electeds to solve the housing crisis, John. So I think what we did today, though, was acknowledge a lot of the areas where we can go deeper on, right? Napa does have the ability to make meaningful change. There's not one silver bullet, right? But there's a lot of areas where we could actually create more accessibility for housing.
When I was mayor, we were dealing with housing, especially because we were in such a small community. It's still one of the top issues throughout the valley. We just need to get creative.
But look, we all campaign on it. It shows up on the polls every time, right? So we know it's an issue. So what are we going to do differently? And to me, that's what inspires me, is that we could actually make meaningful change.
I think the conversation's to be continued.
Well, we got to bring more people around the table to do this, and we have those people, right? So on that note, let's cheers to that.
Right on.